Today, America prepares to celebrate its Liberation Day. That's according to its President Donald Trump, who's promised to impose a slew of new tariffs.
Liberation Day, that's the real Liberation Day of America. It's going to make our country very rich because we're the piggy bank that everybody steals from. Business is coming back to the United States.
The President made a decision to not talk to anyone and to impose this regime on every country.
Europe did not start this confrontation. We think it is wrong, but if it is necessary, we have a strong plan to retaliate and we will use it.
We will fight the U.S. tariffs. Nothing is off the table.
We'll look at the impact from US tariffs on our industry and jobs and take all necessary measures.
We're going to be very fair. We're going to be very nice, actually.
China's door will open wider and wider.
It's about making America great again, making it strong and prosperous again. Thank you very much.
But is that going to happen? And is it really as simple as that? It's what we're discussing today on News Desk. I'm Biresh Banerjee.
And I'm Alex Forrest-Whiting, and I'll be taking your comments and questions and putting them to our guests, who we'll meet a little bit later in the stream. We've already had some great comments, actually, on our community post, so I'll just read out a few of those. First of all, Gagaplex says, hey, if Trump's stupidity helps Europe to become more independent of the US, then I'm all for it. Time for those retaliatory tariffs and investments in the European defence industry. Let the USA feel the isolationism they constantly claim to want. WBJ 2000 says a tariff is an import tax that is passed on to the consumer. Congrats, America, you get to pay 25% more. That little voice says nobody wins, it's not a zero-sum game. But Jim C says, hey, I'm excited about seeing fewer German cars here in the US. And the last Kentucky Irregular points out the US has extremely protectionist tariff policies. Why is it wrong for the US to engage in the same policies? Should not both desist? Funny how the left and Europeans in general never want to answer those questions. Well, the last Kentucky, I'm very much hoping that we are going to answer exactly that question a little bit later in the stream, so do stay with us for that. Please keep your questions, your comments, all of you coming in, and we will try to read out as many as we can.
A plethora of opinions there, and I think we're going to be discussing a lot of them, especially this first one about an opportunity perhaps for Europe to be independent of the United States. An interesting thought there. Keep your questions and comments coming in. We'll be bringing them into the discussion. And to have this discussion, we will be joined in some time by an expert from the ING Bank here in Germany. But right now, we have at the table Kassandra Sundt, a DW correspondent from the business department. You've been looking at the tariffs and how they've been coming along, the announcements thereof. Lots to talk about. Welcome.
Thank you.
To Kassandra's right, Jared Reed, an old DW News Desk hand who's going to be bringing us up to speed with where we are exactly with tariffs, the number that have been announced and many promised. So he'll be bringing us up to speed with that. Wade Adams, whom we don't see, is sitting with our technical crew making this stream possible. And Cherie Chan is going to be in the chat talking to you guys and bringing some of the comments into the discussion as well, right?
And also bringing a poll question, I always do every week. This week we are asking, how will Trump's tariffs impact people worldwide? The four options are: first, more jobs, stronger industries; higher prices, global pain; winners and losers, depends on the country; or not a big deal, trade finds a way. So remember to vote, and we'll talk about the results later, yeah? Later
in the program, in the stream. So send us your views, vote in that, and we can bring them up later. But let's start the stream and talk about... what are we talking about? Tariffs.
Tariffs.
Start talking about tariffs.
Everybody here knows what we're talking about, because we're getting lots of comments already. So
I'll be honest at the outset.
Even if he doesn't know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'll be honest at the outset. I mean, we are very curious as well as to how this shapes up, because there's so much economics involved with this, but there's also questions of justice and fairness, right? And we're going to try and discuss that. But let's get started with Jared Reed, who has a roundup of where we are with the tariffs and what we could be expecting in the next few hours, potentially.
Exactly. I'll try and bring us up to speed as best I can. So we know Donald Trump says that tariff is the most beautiful word in the dictionary, so much so that he's already, as we know, imposed quite a few of them on various trading partners, which we're going to get to in a minute. But I guess the question is, why is he doing this? And he believes that the US is being unfairly treated in global trade and that there's an imbalance because he says many nations impose higher tariffs on the US than the US does to them. And we can sort of look at what he means. In some respects, that's true. Wade, you can bring up my screen. We can take a look at how some tariffs differ greatly between the US and its trading partners. Here we can see up the top of this graph how India imposes a much higher levy on US motorcycle imports than the US does to India. Same with cars imported to Argentina and the EU from the US, agricultural products to Japan, and things like ethanol products from the US to Brazil. And on the surface, yes, this does appear imbalanced in a way that we've, our colleagues here have chosen these specific examples. But it is important to point out that there are deeper, more complex explanations behind some of these imbalances than just these pure statistics and numbers that we've shown. And that brings me to some of the arguments against tariffs and what Donald Trump has been doing. Economists argue that they lead to higher prices for consumers, that export-oriented industries will be hard hit, that inflation could be driven up and that growth could be curbed as a result. And crucially, they say that the US actually benefits from trade imbalances because this solidifies the dominance of the US dollar in trade for various reasons that maybe we're going to be speaking about a little bit later on. But let's look at what has been announced already, and I'm going to change my screen here. They affect the biggest exporters to the US, which are, according to usimportdata.com, Mexico, which exported over $500 billion worth of goods to the US last year, vehicles being the main item, followed by China. Electrical machinery and equipment are the items to look at here. And then Canada, where it's mineral fuels and mineral oil. So this is a very helpful website. Thank you to usimportdata.com. And if I can just reduce my screen, this might take me a few seconds, but I'm going to bring up some graphs that have been prepared for us. Let's look at what Donald Trump has done since he has come into office. So this graphic here shows that he has imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods, 10% on Canadian energy, as well as 20% tariffs on Chinese goods on top of the already existing tariffs applied there. He has introduced 25% tariffs on imported steel and aluminium last month and has vowed ones of the same size on vehicles shipped to the US from today. And he's put tariffs on countries that import oil from Venezuela as well. So what's been the response so far? Well, Canada has retaliated with tariffs on about $20 billion worth of US goods, including steel and aluminium, as well as other goods too, like computers and sport equipment. Cast iron products are included in that. China has announced that it's going to hike levies of between 10 to 15% that cover a range of American agricultural and food products. And the EU has said that it's imposing levies of up to 50% from this month on various products. It's important to stress too that these are about goods and we're mostly talking about them, but we can also talk about services because the data shows that the EU has had for quite a long time a trade deficit with the US when it comes to services, but it does seem that Donald Trump really is focused mostly on goods. Now, what's happening this evening? We're all waiting with bated breath. We're going to do a little bit, not too much speculation, but we'll see. But whatever tariffs are coming today, the White House says that trade deficits won't be the only criteria for deciding who's getting what and when and why. So, yeah, it's all still very vague as it stands now.
for a few hours at least. But Jared, thanks so much. It's a lot to take in, right? I think we're going to keep going back to those graphics that you've prepared to just see where we are and how things are going to potentially change. Which brings me to you, Kassandra. What are we going to hear in a few hours from now from the Rose Garden?
If I knew that, I would be a very, very rich woman. But I think part of the fact that we don't know, right, and this is the same week that maybe some of these tariffs could be imposed, is what's freaking out some of these countries, from central bankers to politicians to even these companies. This uncertainty is really not a good thing for businesses. And so everyone's waiting to see how this shakes out and what specific countries and what specific industries are going to be affected.
Let's see if we can bring in Inga Fechner. She's a senior economist with the ING Bank in Germany. I'm just checking to make sure. Oh, there she is. Inga, welcome. I hope you can see us and hear us as well. We're just trying to speculate a bit and try and see what we can expect to hear from Donald Trump in some hours. I mean, the reason we're trying to speculate is because a lot has been said. There's been some chatter about sector-specific tariffs. There's been some chatter about specific tariffs on specific countries. I think been described as the dirty 15, the 15 nations with whom there is a high trade deficit. There's also talk about imposing tariffs across the board. What are you expecting as an economist?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question. We are sort of expecting probably a flat tariff rate, so a baseline tariff. In the news, it's been speculated about this 20% tariff on all countries. That might well be. But I would also expect higher tariffs for some countries because there are quite some differentials in the tariff rates. And then, as Trump stated often before, there will probably also be some sector-specific tariffs in addition to those baseline tariffs. So he already mentioned car tariffs, which come into effect as of tomorrow. Then he also mentioned pharmaceuticals and semiconductors. So those might be sectors who will face even more tariffs than this baseline tariff. But as you said, we also don't know what's going to happen. We're also looking forward to tonight and hope for some more clarity.
I mean, you seem to have covered all kinds of tariffs that are potentially possible, I would imagine. Baseline tariffs of around 20%, higher tariffs for some particular countries, and also sector-specific tariffs. If all of this were to come to pass, how disruptive would that be for a global trade? I mean, will global trade stop overnight? What's going to happen?
No, the good thing is that global trade won't stop overnight. Because, first of all, you still have those supply chains, you still have those industries being set up abroad, you still have those imports flowing in. Of course, you also have goods which are really essential to the United States, which they can't make themselves. For example, certain pharmaceutical imports, they do depend on those imports. They can't just say, okay, we won't import that anymore. Also, when you look at raw materials, for example, those are also essentials which the United States still need. So global trade definitely won't stop overnight, but it's going to create a huge mess, that is for sure. And it creates lots of uncertainty. We already see this uncertainty. We see the stock market volatility. So that's really what's happening. And then those adjustments would need to set in. So in regards of supply chains, when other countries do retaliate, then it creates an even greater mess. So that's basically what's going to happen. But in the beginning, probably not that much changes. It would just mean really higher prices and inflationary pressure for the United States.
Those higher prices would come into effect immediately, right? I mean, because if these tariffs are imposed, then prices become immediately expensive for Americans. Is that correct?
Depends a bit on the good. So you have durable goods and you have non-durable goods. So, for example, when you look at non-durable goods such as lettuce, tomatoes, avocados, then you would pretty much feel the price hike instantly because you can't really store those goods. When you look at other goods such as cars, such as washing machines, laptops, etc., then you usually have lots of those products in store. So you can first run down your inventory. inventory. That's also what we can take from history. So when you look back at those 2018 washing machine tariffs, in the first couple of months, nothing really happened in terms of price changes because the retailers, the wholesalers could run down their inventory. So nothing really happened. But then those tariffs did kick in and prices started to increase. And interestingly, not only the prices for those foreign goods or foreign imported washing machines, but also domestic manufacturers did increase the prices in order to take away more profit. So therefore, it might well be that prices and maybe also then inflation rises across the board.
Just lots of comments generally about this whole issue. Interesting what you're saying about washing machines, the fact that even for those domestic washing machines, the price is still increased. I do find that very interesting. But I'm being asked a couple of times now by somebody called Hector, who is asking what the impact of US tariffs would be on the dollar and whether that is going to affect the price of the dollar. I don't know if we're OK to talk about that now, if you want to talk about it a bit later. He has asked 3 times and seems particularly interested in that question. So what difference would it make to the dollar, which, of course, is very high?
Yeah, that is really an interesting development that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So usually it would be the case that when those tariffs are applied, that the dollar would appreciate. So that's also sort of the reasoning of the US administration. They claim that tariffs won't hurt the consumer because when the dollar appreciates, then it gets more cheap. Then it gets cheaper in order to import. But what we are currently seeing is that the dollar is devaluating because of recession fears, because of inflationary pressure, because of fears that the central bank would need to cut rates. So it really, we are really seeing the opposite effect. And when the dollar devaluates, then actually imports once again become more expensive. Add to that the tariffs and imports, it really is going to hurt the consumer. So in theory, the dollar should appreciate, but that's currently not happening because the negative consequences for the US economy currently outweigh those positive effects that a dollar appreciation would usually contain.
I'd like to just take a step back and bring you in here, Kassandra. Just remind us, I mean, before we start discussing the tariffs, what, according to the Trump administration, is the advantage, the benefit of these tariffs? What benefit will this bring to Americans?
There's a few arguments floating around here, and often with the Trump administration, it's unclear what came first, the chicken or the egg, the policy or the idea by Mr. Trump, right? So he loves this idea of tariffs. So then has the policy been crafted after that, or was someone in his ear beforehand and the word he heard was tariffs, and then he's coming out with it, right? But the question being, what do they see as the benefit? One is, frankly, punishment. There's this idea of an unfairness, like a fundamental unfairness between how the U.S. treats goods coming from other countries and how those other countries treat American goods. So there's this idea of fairness that he's mentioned several times when talking about tariffs. And I've tried to wrap my head a little bit around the Mar-a-Lago Accords. It's this term now that's been quite buzzy in the financial press in the last couple of weeks. And that's essentially this theory about weakening the dollar. But before you can do that, raising tariffs, like bringing out the stick and then potentially lowering the tariffs to get an accord with some financial ministers from other countries, basically using already high tariffs as a negotiating tactic. So I think that they see it as, like they've said, the Trump administration, a silver bullet. There are many potential benefits to this, but how the cost for that in the short term is, I think, what business journalists like myself are going to be watching. What is the cost to actually get to this goal that the Trump administration is pushing?
Inga, we're looking at tariffs, and it's not just the United States that is proposing tariffs or has in the past. There are other countries, and the European Union, for example, a union that imposes tariffs. So it would appear that tariffs per se are not bad, and they are needed or used. And if that is the case, then why are these proposed tariffs from Donald Trump and the Trump administration being viewed with such skepticism if tariffs are a normal thing?
Yeah, You've got a fair point there. So many countries, including the European Union, apply tariffs. The European Union even has a slightly higher tariff than the United States. That is true. And tariffs are often used for several reasons. So one reason, which is also largely agreed on, which is also acceptable, is that a country tries to shield, for example, a young industry, a young sector from foreign competition. So when you want to set up a new industry, but you have a really mature industry from outside, then that's a valuable means in order to apply tariffs, in order to build this industry in the first place, because otherwise the global competition would not allow the country to set up this industry. So that is a thing that countries can do. It's also a thing sometimes to protect the jobs market. So, for example, when another country has lower wages and can produce goods at a lower price, then you can sort of shield your industry from those lower wages, from this cheaper price, and then you can also apply a tariff. What we've also seen are those anti-dumping countermeasures, anti-dumping tariffs. For example, last year we had those anti-dumping tariffs coming into effect on cars made in China, so electric vehicles made in China. That's when the European Union applied those anti-dumping measures, because they said, okay, the Chinese authorities are treating the manufacturers in China, they are subsidizing them, so that is unfairly. So therefore we need to protect our domestic manufacturers here. So therefore they did increase the tariffs quite substantially. But those are means that those are ways that are acceptable within the rules of trade that we have. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization, it lays out the rules for trade, and that is an acceptable way. You can go to the WTO and you can say, okay, we want those tariffs. There is an investigation. And it's a manner, so it's an acceptable manner to do that. What we're now seeing with the Trump administration is that it's just unorthodox. It follows no real plan. The administration or Trump just goes in with a sledgehammer, and it doesn't really is built on fair ground. So if we would see tonight those purely reciprocal tariffs, so indeed raising the tariff rate in the United States to the tariff rate applied by other countries, for example, raising the US car rate to 10%, which also the European Union applies, that would be truly reciprocal, that would be fair. But now also citing non-trade barriers such as VAT, such as digital services taxes, such as environmental standards, etc., that just creates a huge mess, and that is not built on fair grounds, that is violating trade agreements, and that is why there's all this fuss about those plans.
You know, I'm glad that you mentioned cars. Sorry,
yeah, because I've quite a few messages about cars
because
as well
I did want to talk about cars in specifically. Let's just bring up that graphic that you had, which was about how tariffs differ between the United States and trading partners. You know, the one that listed the things on cars, agricultural products, ethanol, motorcycles.
Yeah.
If we can sort of bring that up. Again, Inga, I'm glad that you brought that up, and people are also asking questions on that. Let that graph come up, and I just wanted to... so, Inga, you said basically that one of the reasons why people bring up tariffs, impose tariffs, there you go, is to shield against outside competition. So in this graph, you see that the European Union imposes 10% tariffs on cars coming in from the US, whereas the US does only at about 2.5%. As far as we know here, sitting in Germany, the EU does have a developed car industry, particularly here in Germany. Then why impose a 10% tariff on cars coming from the United States? That sounds a bit like protectionism and complete unfairness, right?
Sort of does. So, as I've said, there Trump has a point when he says, "Okay, we're also raising our tariff rate to 10%." That actually would be fair, because then the United States would apply the same tariff rate. We shouldn't forget, though, that the United States applies 25% tariff rate on light vehicle trucks. So those beloved Ford F-150, for example, that the Americans love so much. Here, the United States is quite keen to shield their domestic manufacturers, indeed, also with tariffs. Of course, it's also by means of historical developments. So we probably wouldn't need those 10% tariffs. It definitely is a means of still protecting the industry. But I think that now, I don't think so, it already has been decided that we are now going to see a 25% tariff increase. And it's in addition to already applied tariffs. So actually now cars entering into the United States face a 27.5% tariff rate. And that, of course, is not reciprocal anymore. That is what angers the car manufacturers, because now the United States would apply a higher tariff by far than the European Union does. So if it would only be a 7.5% percentage point increase, that would be fair. You can't argue against that. But applying this 25% increase, that is not fair anymore.
OK, thanks for that. And just to a quick hello to Sparks, who was asking about cars. Why does the EU not play fair on cars? You've just explained that. And the same to Rega, who was asking you to explain why it would be wrong for Trump to put in reciprocal tariffs. But as you've just explained, it's not reciprocal because it's way over that 10%. Now it's 25%. But Wayne says this: Americans will be impacted by higher car prices because no car is completely American-made. And surely that is part of the problem now with these tariffs, isn't it? Because we know that parts are coming from Canada, Mexico. That's excluding the EU. So how is that all going to work for the American consumer?
Not well at all. And that is exactly the problem. So especially those tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods, they are especially hitting the US consumer hard, because before we had NAFTA, then USMCA actually agreed under Trump. But now he really sees that as unfair. But he was the one negotiating a USMCA, so the trade agreement between US, Mexico and Canada. And due to this trade agreement, those three countries were basically seen as one. So many US manufacturers do produce in Mexico, in Canada. Some auto parts cross the border several times in order for the car to be manufactured in the United States. So they're really interlinked. And the thing is that the Trump administration claims that all of those tariffs will be stacked onto another. So we have 2.5% usual car tariff, then the 25% tariff on Canadian goods, then even more tariffs probably coming in, 25% on cars. If you put that all together, then it just gets extremely expensive in order to import cars and car parts, because car parts are also part of the deal. And there are not really that many car manufacturers, except for Tesla, who do build lots of their cars in the United States. It's massively going to increase the cost for a US-made car, or any car being imported to the United States.
I want to add something about car costs in the United States, right? We might not see car prices increase dramatically immediately. But the thing about a car factory is it's not built overnight. And so this could be something where we're seeing costs rise over time. And these tariffs that have been imposed so far, it's almost literally like my rent is due, you know, like the first of the month we're getting new tariffs. It's going to happen every month. These are coming so fast and furious without a clear direction that I was speaking to the chief economist of an investment bank called Natixis recently, Alicia Garcia-Herrero, and she was talking about one of the fears that she's hearing is that investment is going to be the overnight victim to this. If these companies don't know, where they can build their facilities. Okay, maybe you want to build a new manufacturing plant somewhere, but where? Where is going to be least affected by these tariffs from the largest economy in the world? It's this directionlessness that I think is driving a lot of business fears right now.
Just on the point of investment, I mean, one of the things that the Trump administration has said is it wants to encourage U.S. manufacturing, made in America cars, and it also wants to boost jobs.
Yep.
As I have seen it, based on the data that I have seen, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of European manufacturers, for example, have already created plants that produce cars that are made for the American market, and the large majority of European cars that are sold in America are made in America, creating jobs as well. So it makes me wonder why the Europeans don't get an exemption on this when they seem to be fulfilling what the Trump administration wants already.
It seems to me that sometimes this view of car manufacturing in the United States is a few decades behind, or at least the popular conversation around it, right? The kind of manufacturing that's done in the United States is very high level. There's a lot of automation involved. And so these facilities that, whether they were making steel or cars in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, maybe not the 90s, but that before would have provided tens of thousands of jobs. Now they're providing a few thousand, close to 10,000 jobs. The kind of jobs that existed in these sectors just because of automation and getting away with one of the highest costs here, which is a labor cost for a business. There's just not many jobs as there was now, as there was then. Something else, again, viewing the U.S. from our vantage point, I was wondering, okay, how much manufacturing is actually left in the United States? Because it sounds like it's been decimated based on the way that some of these politicians talk about it. The United States is still the second largest manufacturing country in the world, China obviously being the first. I have some numbers in front of me.
That just sounds, based on the narrative.
Well, part of it is high-value products, right? You have Teslas that are going to be 5 figures, right? But I was looking at some data recently, and global manufacturing output, 31.6% of it comes from China, and 15.9% comes from the United States. And then you get into the single digits with Japan, Germany, and India after that. So there is still a lot of manufacturing in the United States, but to produce one car just takes fewer people now because so much of it has been modernized and just, requires fewer man hours.
It's very interesting you say that, and therefore that brings me to a question for you, Inga. Is Donald Trump applying tariffs but in the wrong time? We were talking, we always think about tariffs, especially from the US side, in the time of the 40s, for example, or pre-World War II, in which manufacturing and the globalized economy didn't really exist in that fashion. So I wonder if tariffs, in that sense, the way Donald Trump and the Trump administration is talking about them, are slightly out of date and not matching the era that we are in.
Yeah, you can get the impression, indeed, because, the United States, it's a service-oriented industry, so 70% of GDP is coming from services. So it's really a good question why he is so keen on tariffs and what is the ultimate goal, indeed. Is it for negotiation purposes? Is it really to bring in revenue? Is it really to bring back US manufacturing, which in those times doesn't make that much sense, because you could only produce probably rather low-valued goods, and therefore it's too expensive in the United States to make lots of those low-value products. So it's going to be interesting to see the ultimate goal of the Trump administration, what he really wants. Of course, he's mentioning the trade deficit. He's saying that manufacturing declined, but that is the case for many advanced industries. That's just what's happening, that the service sector gains popularity. So it's also the question, why would you want to bring back those industries which aren't that beneficial to many workers per se? So it's quite a conundrum that we're seeing here.
I just want to pick up on what Nile Chaturvedi says just regarding this whole issue of is Trump doing this for a bygone period. He says, applying 19th century policy to 20th century framework to get results in the 21st century harms everyone, increases prices, and will reduce growth. The other point I just wanted to put to you is from Mr. Drake, who picks up on this issue of the service industry. You just said that the US is very much service orientated now. Mr. Drake says, shouldn't the service market and online stuff like Facebook, Google and X that makes money on EU citizens be taken into account, or is it already?
It's already taken into account. We do have digital services taxes in many EU countries. That's also what Trump doesn't like. So he might also go against those digital services taxes per se. And he also wants those revenues flowing into the United States and not for other countries reaping the benefits. But in order to do so, the United States would need to change their tax laws, basically. And that's not what was warranted over the last couple of years, so that was quite an issue. But that might be a way to also reap the benefits for the United States and not to leave the profits to other nations. But as I said, there are lots of discussions going on, so it might make sense for the United States to review their tax policy. And therefore, it's also one of the things taking into account this digital services tax applied by the EU, which also might lead to higher tariffs as of tonight.
Yeah, and sorry, just to butt in there, and of course the UK have been talking about a similar tax, but they've also been talking about maybe they won't impose it as they wait to find out what happens with tariffs as well. So it's obviously affecting many countries around the world.
Just a quick history lesson, if you can give us that. I mean, what has the US experience been with tariffs in the past? Because earlier we were talking about this 25% tax, if I'm not wrong, on pickup trucks, for example, coming from the EU, which is why the US has a monopoly, so to speak, on pickup trucks that are produced in the US. That was also a result of US tariffs, weren't they? I think, wasn't it in the 40s or something?
Don't recall the exact timing, but there were lots of disputes going back and forth, indeed. So sometimes it's also completely unrelated. So I think there was a whiskey dispute or something, wherefore higher tariffs were applied, and they never went away. But I'm not too sure about the exact history. But when we look at the periods that the United States did apply extremely high tariffs, especially in the 1800s, it was a different time, of course, but it never ended well. There was only one period that Trump now likes to mention where the United States had high tariffs, and high growth, but that was mainly due to immigration coming in and high demand from immigrants, and it wasn't really related to those high tariffs. So you should look for the cause of why economic growth was doing well. And when you look at all those periods when the United States did apply higher tariffs, it usually resulted in recession and inflationary pressure, global trade wars. So the United States was never better off when really entering a global trade dispute.
Kassandra, can you talk a bit about the EU and the EU, because we're sitting in Berlin, let's just talk about the EU. Are there recessionary fears here in the EU as well as a result of these tariffs?
There's not been comment that I've read specifically about fears, but the EU is ready to respond. And one of the things that puts the EU in a vulnerable position is that its GDP growth from 2023 to 2024 was only 0.9%. If you compare that same period in the United States, it was about 2.8%, and China's figure was 5%. So there's not a lot of growth happening here in comparison to some of these other top economies. And so when I was talking to this chief economist yesterday, she was saying it's one of these things where Europe can't really afford can't afford this fight and can't not afford to fight this fight. There has to be a unified front here in order to act quickly. She was skeptical if the EU could act quickly because sometimes things move a bit slowly in Brussels. But what we've heard so far from the EU Commission President, the European Commission President, has been that they do want to work together on this. I think we might even have a clip for that.
This is from Ursula von der Leyen, right?
Yes, exactly.
But my message to you today is that we have everything we need to protect our people and our prosperity. We have the largest single market in the world. We have the strength to negotiate. We have the power to push back. Europe holds a lot of cards, from trade to technology to the size of our market. But this strength is also built on our readiness to take firm countermeasures if necessary. All instruments are on the table.
So in terms of when we can expect a response, I've been reading some reporting that there are meetings scheduled for Friday. Whether or not a Friday response is quick enough to a Wednesday evening meeting, I'll leave that up to viewers and commenters. But there are cards to play here, right? We've been talking about some of these tech companies from the United States that operate in Europe. There's been a little bit of reporting that this could be, depending how severe these tariffs from the United States are, that maybe taxing or putting a tariff on some of these goods, these electronic goods, could be on the cards here in Europe.
So we need to buy things quickly now then, is what you're saying.
There's also an argument that that's been happening in the United States already, that the reason that we haven't seen some of these economic downturns already is because people know that tariffs are coming, and so they're pre-buying some of these shelf-stable goods, but also things that will last.
Yeah. I just want to sort of expand this and look at, go back on an idea that we touched at the start of the stream as to what all of this is building up to, if the tariff plan is part of a larger plan. Inga, if I can just put it to you, we keep hearing about the so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord, which is about devaluing the dollar. Is that the overall plan? And is the idea to try and devalue the dollar and reshape global trade in favor of the United States? It just sounds like a fantastic aim, but is that what the deal is?
Might be. So Stephen Miran, the author of this paper, of this Mar-a-Lago Accord, he said in a recent interview that for the time being, Trump is really focused on tariffs, and that he might consider his blueprint as of next year, but for the time being, that is not the overall goal. So, but it is out there, and it also gets lots of apprehension from many parties. So indeed, tariffs would be a first step to introduce this Mar-a-Lago Accord in order to devalue the dollar. But we also have to say some people do compare it to the Plaza Accord back from 1985. That was when the United States, UK, France, Germany and Japan met in order to find a common solution in order to devalue the dollar. But those were different times, and those nations did hold 1/4 of the US dollar reserves. Now the picture looks sort of different. Now China holds the most US reserves, and I don't really see China coming to the table and saying, oh yeah, we are going to play by your rules. Because with this Mar-a-Lago Accord, it's basically wanted to devalue the dollar indeed in order to make exports more cheaper, and that's the ultimate goal. But in order to do so, they do want to use a carrot and stick approach. So the stick there might be getting under the US security umbrella, and if you don't comply, you face higher tariffs and you won't get US security anymore. So that's sort of what is being planned. And in order to devalue the dollar, governments and private institutions should sell their T-bills and transform them into longer bonds. In this case, transform their 10, 20, 30-year bonds into a bond with a 100-year maturity, where they don't really get a yield from. So it doesn't really make any sense to swap that, and therefore they need the tariffs, and therefore they need the security threat in order to get investors to do so. But it would be a huge, unprecedented experiment. I think it wouldn't really resonate well with financial markets. I mean, the United States is the reserve currency of the world. I don't see a depreciation of the dollar, but then also staying the reserve currency really play hand in hand. So that's another conundrum. It wouldn't really play out well. So Trump might have a great master plan. He might be 10 steps ahead on the chessboard, but I don't really see that from an economic perspective. So from the European angle, all of this doesn't add up, and it doesn't really make sense.
Oh, wow. There's a lot of stuff in there. I'm trying to get my head around that. I'm just going to come to you, Kassandra, for a clarification on one thing. A 100-year bond, why is that far worse than a 10 to 20-year bond?
I do not have a good answer for you on that. Apologies. I think Inga's speaking at a higher level than maybe I've gotten up to speed on.
Can you just help us understand this? Because we were discussing this as well in the team. What is the deal with that? What is the deal with the 100-year bond and the 10 to 20-year bond? Like, how is one better than the other? Just It's basic economics 101 for you, but for me, it is very high level stuff.
So the longer the maturity, the longer the US government has security about the funding. And the plans also entail that the yield is only paid once, so only every 100 years. So far, it's usually paid semi-annual. So the US government has to fulfill those obligations. It has to fulfill its interest rate payments. And if you delay that, of course, you have more fiscal space in order to operate. And that's basically the idea. So to have long-term funding, but basically at no interest. And of course, no investor really would take up that deal voluntarily.
It sounds like a wonderful deal.
Yeah, I mean, really. I'm not the biggest of investors, but
okay.
I did also.
Now that makes sense.
I also thought it was very interesting, Inga, when you said, which probably everybody knows, but again, for me, I feel like I'm learning so much on this particular stream. China holds the most US reserves. I wasn't aware of that. So that's quite fascinating. Like, as you were saying, that they wouldn't necessarily want to undo those trades at the moment. Lots of messages coming in on our chat, so thank you, everyone. One thing that came up a little bit earlier that I think Cherie was aware of as well, talk about something called the chicken tax. Did you see that, Cherie?
Yeah, I did.
People asking, what was the chicken tax? And apparently, I don't know anything about this, but apparently it was the EU was trying to sell chickens to...
Was it the EU or was it Germany? I think it was Germany, wasn't it,
to the
Inga?
US. And
this is from way back in the last century, I think. Inga, do you know about the chicken tax?
I do, but I don't recall it. I'm sorry, I don't recall it in detail.
It's interesting, though, because I was looking at a list put out by Politico that it could be some of the new tariffs that the EU is imposing on the U.S. And there were some interesting items on there. There was a lot of chicken parts and a lot of different kinds of chickens, like grandparent chickens. They broke it down. And also communion wafers, which I found out that a lot of communion wafers are made...
That's in church.
Yeah. Catholic communion, are made in Rhode Island. And I used to live very close to Rhode Island, so that was funny.
The Wall Street Journal says, it explains what the chicken tax is. The US has imposed a 25% tariffs on imported trucks ever since President Lyndon Johnson hit back at European levies on American poultry in 1963.
Thank you.
Trucks for chickens.
Trucks for chickens.
That's why one
So it wasn't a Germany thing, it was an EU thing, although the EU didn't really exist as a union then, but yeah, Europe.
Right.
Yeah, that's why one of our viewers said America has had protectionist tariffs like the chicken tax for foreign trucks. The result is no BMW or Mercedes trucks were made, and resulting in non-competitive truck market in the US. That has something to do with what Jared was just referring to.
And that's the one that's dominated by American companies like Ford and everything. I got to the bottom of that.
Full circle.
Chickens for trucks.
Chickens for trucks.
Look at that. Look at that. I'm glad that came up. Let's just go to the ground zero. What the eyes of the world are going to be on Washington, D.C. in a few hours. I mean, they have been for quite some time. But today, especially given that today is Liberation Day, our correspondent, DW Washington correspondent, Janelle Dumalaon, is awake and ready to embrace Liberation Day and cover the events for us on DW News. Janelle, good to see you in the morning. You have a big day ahead of you. What is the vibe? What is the vibe you're feeling in D.C.? Is there anticipation, expectation that today is the day America finally achieves freedom as promised?
Yes, Biresh, and we can all move on from there.
That was that.
No, if only it were quite that simple, right? But yes, of course, happy Liberation Day to those who celebrate, I guess. But so I don't know how many times you've already heard this in the course of your discussion, but the vibe here is still uncertainty, uncertainty, uncertainty. We've been hearing that Donald Trump had been working on perfecting these tariffs since late in the night. And I've been saying this over and over, but it's quite a strange situation. I feel like we've been talking about tariffs since the first term, tariffs since the campaign. It's always been on the table. It's Trump's favorite word, the most beautiful word in the dictionary. And today has come and we still don't know exactly what he's going to do. And I feel like the vibe matches that situation. It feels like series finale vibes here. Everybody is waiting for what's going to happen. But of course, we're still at the very beginning.
Or the start of another series. but you know, Janelle, there's been enough reporting on this, and even in the American media, that in the short term, at least, however long the short term is, that prices will potentially go up. And we've been talking to Inga. She's also been talking about especially perishable items, and their prices go up. If things affecting foodstuffs, for example. Add to that the high price of eggs that the United States is already experiencing. What do Americans think? Forget the government and the administration. How are Americans looking at this, especially given these warnings of an immediate price hike potentially for essential goods?
Americans are not pleased. I mean, at least I've been talking to many consumers, many businesses, and I would not say their opinions are universal, but there was a poll out earlier this week from the AP that said that 60% of Americans surveyed were unhappy with how Trump was handling trade and the economy. And among the consumers that I've talked to, going back to that uncertainty aspect again, they don't really know how to plan their expenses. So I think it was Kassandra saying earlier that a lot of Americans are really looking into stockpiling at least goods that have a longer shelf life. There's really not much you can do to stockpile goods that, of course, don't stay fresh. But I was also talking to other consumers who said, well, you know, if things are going to become more expensive, if life is going to become more expensive, shouldn't the thing that I be doing actually be saving? So again, your mileage may vary. It depends on your specific economic situation, how you are going to prepare for potential price hikes. But I think it is fair to say most Americans are expecting them, and they are unhappy that they are on the horizon because, of course, many of them voted for Donald Trump with the expectation that he would be the one to get inflation under control. So I think that's an especially bitter disappointment for many American voters.
And just like to sort of zoom out a bit, and quite a zoom out so that we can look at the globe and particularly Asia. And the reason I talk about Asia is basically these proposed actions and whatever announcements have already been made seem to be already making their presence felt geopolitically, if one looks at it in that way. And the reason I bring this up is especially in regard to Asia, because you have South Korea, China and Japan, whose ministers met for the first time in 5 years. This was over the weekend. And they decided to speed up talks on a free trade agreement among the three nations. And the reason this appears important is because you have South Korea and Japan, which are treaty allies of the United States, teaming up with China, in a sense, which is a sworn competitor of the United States, and saying that they want to work on a free trade agreement. I want to talk about that, but maybe it's just worth listening to what China's Commerce Minister had to say about this particular meeting. Let's just listen to that and then pick it up from there.
Due to intensified geopolitical conflicts and the spread of unilateralism and protectionism, the global economy is facing instability and immense pressure from uncertainty. China, Japan and South Korea bear an important responsibility to promote regional and global prosperity. We should work together to safeguard the free trade system while opposing unilateralism and protectionism.
So China talking about protecting the free trade system. Is that music to Washington's ears? I mean, how is the Trump administration reacting to things like that?
Yeah, it's really funny. You know, you've pointed out that South Korea and Japan are treaty allies. China, with the United States, China is considered an adversary. And really, it really does seem as if the Trump administration's policy is pushing countries like South Korea and Japan into China's arms. Also, by the way, countries that have a deep historical enmity with one another. Yep. And of course, they're not all talking about this meeting the same way. You had China saying that what they're doing is coordinating a tariff response to the Trump administration. South Korea and Japan are saying, it was not quite that. That might be an overstatement of what this meeting was. But, you know, we discussed deeper economic cooperation and strengthening our supply chains. And as such, but I think the point that we have to make there is that this meeting did happen. They're definitely talking about this. Now, the Trump administration, for what it's worth, it's already looking at how its sort of trading partners around the world are going to react. He's already reacted Trump, that is, has already reacted quite badly to sort of the idea that the EU and Canada might cooperate against the United States as a result of these tariff policies. So I can well imagine he looks at what the other trading partners around the world, like those Asian trading partners like South Korea and Japan, and saying, well, this is not the situation as I would have drawn it up. But his response, if I can guess, with Trump, it's hard to guess, the response is probably going to center on tariffs again. Like, that seems to be his go-to tool. So if they start cooperating, he might put on more tariffs.
Alex is going to come in for a second, but I just wanted to comment and say that it's great that we're talking to you about geopolitics and you have the world map behind you. It doesn't get it doesn't get better than that as an apt, appropriate background. But yeah, Alex.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Janelle, RCR 7719 says, it's just a comment, China protecting the free trade system, how ironic. And then we have this other question from Carolina to you, Janelle, asking, just coming back to the US and Americans, do tariffs make Americans feel betrayed by Trump? Do you get that sense, or is it too political to be able to say that, as in divided between Republicans and Democrats?
So, yeah, I guess commenting on that first comment from our viewer there about how ironic it is, of course, yes, I do agree that is very ironic. One of the chief complaints about business that businesses have when they try to do business in China is that the playing field is not at all equal. So yes, we have arrived at a very strange time indeed, where China is having to be the defender of free trade in this new geopolitical constellation. As for Carolina's question, hello, Carolina, nice to hear from you. So the question was whether Americans feel betrayed by Trump's tariff policy. I think the correct answer is that some of them do feel betrayed by the tariff policy, especially as Trump has tried to telegraph to them that prices will increase. There will be pain, right? He has called it short-term pain. Nobody knows exactly. And the price hikes aren't here yet. But I want to go back to this point that I mentioned earlier. A lot of them voted for Trump because they thought he could get prices under control. They thought that he was the stronger economic candidate. Now that he is telling them that they may have to swallow even higher prices than what is currently on the market, the thing is, Americans don't want to experience any pain. It's like, that is not what they voted for. So just based anecdotally on my conversations and that survey that I mentioned earlier, there is some level of disappointment and betrayal there. What we don't know is how much of that will sort of kind of translate into anger at the ballot box come the midterms. Will this be a referendum on tariff policies? But, we're a little bit a ways from that.
And just to pick up on me asking you that, Spark says, I'm a Democrat. I'm fine with tariffs on Europe. Europe took advantage of us by not spending on defence and putting tariffs on us. And DeVos says, I don't feel betrayed as an American.
I still have 15 minutes.
Sorry, hey, I just...
Sorry. I think, was that you, Inga? Do you have to leave?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was asked by
oh, okay.
the studio.
We'll just come back to you.
Okay, sorry. And let me just pick up on that. And DeVos says, I do not feel betrayed as an American. I feel annoyed, I'll put it that way. But this kind of behaviour from him was what so many people were warning about. Smart people were saying the things he was promising he wouldn't be able to deliver on, and he thinks, DeVos, that they were right. So just a couple of comments off the back of that.
I just want to sort of bring in Inga. I did want to come to you, Inga. Sorry for not bringing you in earlier. I just want to sort of get a bit of a feel from on the ground from Janelle. I mean, the general theme here appears to be that there is obviously lots of uncertainty. Janelle is talking about that. It's something that you also alluded to earlier. What does this mean for globalization as a concept, given that America was the principal driver of trade with everybody around the world, and now you have America trying to tax almost everybody around the world in a rather punitive sort of a way. And I wonder if, sitting in your viewpoint as an economist, if you think this is the beginning of the end of globalization as we had known it.
I don't think that it's the beginning of the end of globalization. So when you look at the data, then the US influence in terms of trade, it diminished over the last couple of years. So 20 years ago, indeed, the United States were the driver, also with China, of course, and we had a huge globalization phase, a huge trade and goods phase, and now we sort of reached a peak. So I wouldn't even speak of deglobalization. That's not what's happening. So of course, United States, the policies, that it is an outlier for the time being, but as you've discussed before, it can also draw other countries closer together, and that's also what we're seeing in terms of trade agreements. Also, when you look at the trade agreements that that the European Union did conduct over the last couple of months and years, there's a lot going on, and I think we are up for some sort of renewal of the trade system. Maybe in the end, all those tariffs will have something good in them. Maybe other countries will also lower the tariffs, so maybe we'll enter a new free trade area. So in the end, that might be a possibility, but I definitely wouldn't see the end of globalization per se. Therefore, the supply chains are way too intertwined. Businesses still do like to do business with other countries, with other nations. They still do largely benefit. So I think we're definitely in for a renewal of supply chains, for huge changes coming there. Okay. And the United States might get isolated, maybe as well, if there are no agreements. But I don't see the beginning of deglobalization.
You mentioned the free trade area, and it's a very timely mention of it, because we just spoke to, on DW News, the German finance minister Jörg Kukis, and he was alluding to something like that. Let's just play the soundbite from. It's a snippet from an interview that DW News conducted just a few hours earlier.
In the document that is the basis for forming the new government, both sides actually propose a free trade area between the European Union and the United States. That takes care of all asymmetries, because we would then reduce all tariffs to zero, and then there wouldn't be any discrimination by definition. So in our view, that would be the most advantageous and competitiveness enhancing measure for both sides.
Jörg Kukis there. I wonder if you heard that, Inga. So that is something he's talking about in relation to the European Union and the USA. If we were to expand this to the rest of the world, are we entering this era in which individual nations are going to try and have bilateral deals with the USA, or groupings of nations are going to try and have free trade agreements with the United States? Is that what we're heading into now?
It might be that we see more deals coming. But of course, the problem right now is that the United States are violating every trade agreement, every WTO agreement that is out there. So it makes the United States not the most reliable partner for the time being. So forging out new trade agreements, that might be the end goal, that might be happening, and probably we will see more bilateral agreements coming in. But of course, it really then also depends on the United States fulfilling their part of the agreement, because when we look at USMCA, it's really tough that was the first victim, more or less, after China. Yeah. So I would be a bit hesitant as another nation to really enter this trade agreement without any doubt. So the United States really would need to commit the global trade practices that are in place. Ultimately, maybe we will see that. We will see new trade agreements coming in. That would be really good for trade, for free trade, of course. But I wouldn't expect that coming too soon.
We were talking specifically about Europe. I wanted to come to you, Kassandra, because I do believe that you were looking at what Asian countries are potentially trying to do when it comes to dealing with whatever's coming their way? What can we learn from what they have been doing?
Yeah, I've been looking in the chat as well. I've been creeping, but anonymously, to some of the comments here. And there was a comment from, I believe, Nile, and they were saying essentially that actually China is the biggest trading partner of Europe, for example. That actually changed. I just want to stick with Europe to get to Asia, so follow me down the rabbit hole, everyone. So Europe had this realization after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, like, holy bleep, maybe we rely on some countries a bit too much. And so then you get this move to a China plus one, or a decoupling. You hear these kind of buzzwords, right? One country that really benefited from this was Vietnam, actually. Vietnam is one of about a dozen countries that shares a land border with China. And so it was pretty easy to move some of this manufacturing into Vietnam and maybe get some parts from China, finish them or manufacture it more, I don't know if that's proper English, but make it into a final product in Vietnam, and thereby maybe even skirt some of these tariffs facing products from the EU or the United States, for example. So Vietnam is one country that could be really exposed to global tariffs from the United States, because they've not really faced this before, and they've seen such a growth of manufacturing in the last few years that could be a big issue for them. One thing another commenter was mentioning was this bilateral trade deal that India is working on with the United States right now. I believe that the 4 days of talks wrapped on Saturday. And what this could mean, this bilateral trade negotiation, is maybe this is something that the Indian government could say to the United States, like, hey, we're trying to play ball. We're lowering some of our tariffs. We know they were a bit too high, and that might get them an exemption. I know over the weekend, Trump was saying all countries are going to be facing some of these tariffs, but this could be something that says we're on a first step towards lowering our tariffs. Therefore, maybe let us through on this one this time.
On the path to a bilateral trade deal.
Exactly. Negotiations are going to be going on for weeks, but there was a first round. I believe they had a TOR. I forget what that stands for, but it's basically a framework agreement for the conversations to come.
And just picking up on...
Terms of reference. Thank you, Janelle.
Terms of reference. There you go.
God's
we have
voice
the right
from the
people
ether.
in the chat.
Here for all your bureaucratic needs.
I just wanted to pick up on that then, because there is fear, of course, that if these tariffs come in, but particularly worse between the US and China, that China then is going to start sending much more to the EU. And a question that was in the chat about this as well, what can the EU do to stop then China from so-called dumping all its products, cars, whatever, into the EU? Will they then reciprocate with their own tariffs and we end up in this proper trade war?
Well, that trade war, like this spiral, right, is the fear. But also the dumping, there's rational fears to this as well. When we look at the solar power industry, for example, there used to be like a good number of solar panels that were made in the European Union. Now, I think something like 95%, if not higher, of solar panels are made in China. They're just completely dominating the market. So I think that's a fair concern right now in terms of what the EU will do when it comes to China. I'm not sure. It seems like right now they're looking at their Western front and not their Eastern front as it stands right now. So I agree with some of the comments that we've seen so far that say that this could open up a world where China is playing a much bigger role than it has previously.
Let's bring that to Inga. Is this the time for China to shine? We played a soundbite earlier in which they were talking about essentially alluding to the rules-based order and talking about free trade. Is this China's moment?
It might be. Of course, so China has tried to fulfill trade agreements. It also has tried to play by the WTO rules. So whenever there was, for example, an anti-dumping investigation, they also did bring it to the WTO. Also the US tariffs, they did bring to the WTO to complain about those tariffs. So China tries to play by the rules. That, of course, doesn't take away the fact that there might be some unfairly subsidized areas still. which are also tackled by then those anti-dumping tariffs. So we need to see how this plays out. And of course, other nations, they will be wary of products coming into their respective countries. So of course, they also don't want to have those products to a large extent coming to the country. So indeed, it might set off some sort of tariff spiraling. But as I've said before, that might rather be those anti-dumping measures, so anti-dumping tariffs, which do need an investigation and which do have a legal basis. And I don't see other nations now applying their own set of tariffs just because of what's happening in the United States. I think so far it is really all other nations against the United States. They have a common cause there. So maybe it's going to be a thing for the next couple of years, but at least for this year, it's really going to be the rest of the world versus the United States.
Just as a final comment, I'm just going to try and wrap this up. What does this mean for, what does this mean for people around the world? And I know it's a very broad question, so do tell me if you can't answer it and if the question is wrong. Are we looking at immediate price rises for people around the world, for consumers around the world?
First of all, in the United States, yes, there we will see price increases, which might also be inflationary. So we also need to distinguish between price increases and then also its impact on inflation. Of course, if we do see a 20% universal tariff, then of course that also means that prices will increase across the board. But we shouldn't forget goods imports make up some 3 trillion coming into the US market. And of course, the United States is a much bigger market. So it's not just those tariffs going to influence prices and inflation. Of course, you also have counter effects such as energy prices, such as rent prices, etc. So we probably won't see a huge increase in inflation, but it might increase by a couple of 0.0 percentage points. That might be the case. As regards other countries, it depends on the retaliatory tariffs. So if other countries wouldn't retaliate, that doesn't necessarily, so it doesn't mean that prices will rise. If, of course, other countries also retaliate, then it would also mean for European consumers, for example, that they also face higher tariffs. But of course, it depends on how many goods this is applied to. So if it's only US goods, it's only a fraction of global trade. So that would not lead to a huge inflationary increase. So we always need to distinguish between that. It is not as black and white as we sometimes perceive it.
Inga Fechner from ING Bank in Germany, thank you so much for joining. I've learned something so much. I've learned something through the course of this. Lots of things. I don't understand economics, but you made it quite simple for me and for those in the chat. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We'll speak again soon. Thanks.
So much for having me.
It's been our pleasure.
Just a couple of comments I just wanted to feedback from the chat. The chat's been very lively. Wayne says the tariff war will be a big win for America. But this from Orange Cat, the USA is the unfortunate partner that we love to hate but can't leave.
I wonder what Janelle thinks about that. Any comments on the US being the unfortunate partner?
We love to hate, but we can't leave.
We can't leave. What do you say to that, Janelle? I'm putting you in the spot there.
Well, partner we love to hate, but can't leave. I mean, this has something that has, that has grown over decades, right? Like, so for many countries, the US is the primary trading partner, the primary defense partner. It really is hard to get around that. But like, it really informs Trump's philosophy, I think. We've seen very much how he divides the world into winners and losers, into countries that have the cards and countries that don't have the cards. And he looks at the size of the US market and how countries basically all want access to this gigantic market and therefore can't say no to it. Like, I do think there is something to that comment. And the thing that we have to watch out for now is how other countries react in this new and unusual time.
You have certainly
very diplomatically
very
put,
diplomatically
I think,
put, but very well put. Some very interesting days ahead you have for yourself. In fact, today is one of those really big days. Janelle, thanks so much for joining us in the morning. We know you have up until the evening to be covering a Liberation Day. So good luck with that, but thanks so much for joining us today.
I'll let you know if we get liberated.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
let us know. Post on X. Thanks, Janelle. Take care. Bye. Liberation Day, Kassandra, the beginning of major uncertainty over the next few days?
Yeah, I guess many things are going to be liberated. It's going to be a Pandora's box, I think. Looking from the EU side of things, right, it's important to remember that this trade war can have effects, and our reaction, the EU's reaction can have effects. And so I'm going to be interested to see what the retaliatory tariffs are to the tariffs that are tonight. There's so many tariffs, I almost can't keep track. So yeah, I'm interested to see what our reaction is to the US reaction and so on and so forth.
Since we're looking at things, let's look at the results of the poll. You closed the poll, right?
I did close about
Where
10
are
minutes
we
ago.
with the results?
So we have 594 votes. Let me repeat the question. How will Trump's tariffs impact people worldwide? 56% goes to higher prices, global pain. 25% says winners and losers depending on the country. 9% says not a big deal, trade finds a way, and another 9% said more jobs, stronger industries. It's actually quite surprising to me, these results, because throughout the whole discussion, I see a lot of people saying that the US will actually be the loser, and many are saying that China, for example, would be the winner, but the poll doesn't show the same result.
But it's interesting about the 56% people who think it's going to be higher prices and global pain, because it's exactly the question that I asked Inga, and she said for Americans, yes, in the short term, but for the others, it would depend on whether they retaliate and what kind of tariffs they put. And if it's only on US products, then it would be just a fraction of the kind of products that we talked about. So interesting perspectives there. And with that, I think we're at the end of our stream, unless you have something more to bring up.
No, I just want to say thanks very much to everyone for all your comments. Really great and very, very active in the chat. Do remember that you can find out what we're going to be talking about 24 hours before next Wednesday, so next Tuesday, for those of you who are on European time. And we will let you know what our subject will be and hope that you can join us then. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody, for joining. Thanks, Jared, Kassandra, and Cherie, for being at the table today. Thanks for watching the stream. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.